Welcome to Unapologetically Sensitive, a place to find connection and a sense of belonging, where you can learn, relate, laugh, and maybe even live a bolder, brighter life. I'm your host, Patricia Young. This is a weekly podcast where we talk about sensitivity and the richness that it adds, the strengths we have because of our sensitivity, and some of the challenges it poses as well. The information in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional. Hey there, to the creatives, healers, sensitives, and deep thinkers, welcome. This is a really great episode. This is the first year that I've actually been able to really plan ahead, and I wanted to do a special episode around how can we navigate as sensitives some of the changes and losses that happen for us as we approach and go into the holidays. And Jill Johnson Young did an amazing job with this episode talking about all the different ways that change and loss comes up for us. And at the end gives well over 20 different practical tips and tools on how to manage some of the losses and changes that we may not be considering as loss and changes. I've had many of you reach out to me and that you're realizing that the family that you thought you had isn't. And now that you're having these awarenesses, how do you go back into your families for the holidays, knowing that your parents have limitations, they did the best that they could, but you're just figuring this stuff out. If you've had any changes in job, education, career, relationships, so that's either starting a new relationship, ending a relationship, trying to figure out how are you going to do the holidays with a new partner, with your family. If you have a child that's leaving for college or moving out, if you have children that are getting married or divorced, if your parents are having health issues, if you're having health issues, if your children are having health issues, this can also include the birth of a child or a grandchild or adoption. If you're coming out for the first time to your family or you're claiming what your pronouns are, I mean, there are so many different ways that loss comes up in terms of what we expected and then what happened. And then there's also grief, and we talk about pet loss in this episode. And if you've lost someone close to you, how can you manage? But what I love is Jill really does this amazing reframe in talking about grief in terms of when we lose someone, and I'm not minimizing the loss that we experience, but when we lose someone, Jill really talks about how do we honor that person? How do we bring that person's memories forward? And how do we add their memory into having new traditions for the holidays? And I just love this concept. And I have a lot of fear around my mom dying, and she's very healthy at this point. But after having this discussion, I can really see that when I have that fear come up, I can start thinking about the ways that she loves me, that I care for her, that I can carry forward in my heart instead of having this anticipatory sadness and grief, to really embrace the ways that we connect and how I'm going to bring that forward and how there's a part of her spirit that's always going to be here with me. My fear in doing this episode was that if people saw grief or loss, that they wouldn't want to listen to it. They'd have a fear of being overwhelmed. What Jill talks about in this episode is the way that we manage these things is to work through it, to talk about, anticipate, and prepare for it. So if you're pushing the button or your thumb is hovering over the stop on this, you need to honor and listen to yourself. But I really feel like this episode was done in a very respectful and beautiful way. I think we talk about real things. I would like to believe that it's not a depressing episode, but you're going to have to decide for yourself. But I feel like I did a lot of preparation in preparing for this episode to do it in a way that really is creative and talks about ways that we can manage and how we can talk to our partner if we've had a partner that's had loss, and giving literal words that you can use to generate a conversation. Also in this episode, we talk about Lupercalia, a new holiday called Woofanoot. In the beginning of this interview, I start out a little bit stiff and I talk about it. I'm pretty transparent about what was going on. I normally would have edited this out, but I left it in because I think that it's just important to show part of the process. I also want to give a shout out in our closed Facebook group called Unapologetically Sensitive. You're welcome to join. I want to give a shout out to Amber Lansford, Julie W., Jenny Jansen, and Susan Roeder. And there's one other person, and her name is mentioned in the episode, that I had posted in the group asking about how you felt about having this type of an episode, what you wanted to hear about. And so many of the things that we talk about in this episode are from the ideas and thoughts that you generated in this group. And so I really appreciate you. A few of the things we talk about are the expectations that we have around the holidays, how you can take care of yourself. Jill actually coaches me on something specific that I was working through, and I'm going to give a follow-up that will air a week from Tuesday if you're listening to this in live time, and I'll tell you how that went. She talks about how to set boundaries, how to create new traditions. I think it's just a really helpful episode, and if you've stumbled across this and it's not the holidays, I think this information is relevant year-round. During the episode, I've got Gracie on my lap, and that's where she is when I record. And my neighbor Matt and Buster walk by, and Buster's a dog. And I just acknowledge that that's going on. If you're listening to this is going to air on November 19th, 2019. I spoke with Matt a few days later, and Buster's having some pretty serious health issues. He's having some issues with his liver. If you believe in prayer, sending good juju, whatever it is that you're comfortable, if you can just send some light to Matt and Buster because they have a very close and special relationship. If you're enjoying the show, please continue to share it with other people. If you're open to rating and reviewing, I've had a couple of 1 and 3 star reviews. It's not a big deal, but it does help to have lots of reviews. So if you're comfortable doing that. And then let me tell you a little bit about Jill. Jill Johnson Young, LCSW, is a dynamic and engaging speaker who loves teaching both professional and community groups about dementia, death, and dying and grief and loss. She's the CEO of Central Counseling Services in Riverside, California, where she's also a clinical therapist. She's a certified grief recovery facilitator after spending more than a decade with hospice as a medical social worker and as a director of social services, chaplain, and grief staff. Jill has authored 3 children's grief books and an adult grief workbook with more in process, and created Your Path Through Grief, a year-long comprehensive grief support program which includes resources for therapists. If you're interested in looking in the show notes, Jill mentions the names of her books. I've got links to them in the show notes. These are the most detailed notes because Jill provided me with a really in-depth outline. So if you're interested, you can check out the show notes for more information. And now, on to the show. Hey, Jill, welcome.
Thank you.
I'm really excited to have this conversation with you today.
I am so glad to be here. It was nice to be invited.
Well, thanks. I'm trying to figure out where to start. Let's just go with this one. Do you identify as a highly sensitive person?
I don't normally, but when I'm working with folks who are grieving, I am frequently around people who have their sensitivities heightened because grief does cause us to be a little bit more reactive or a lot more reactive. And in fact, I've set up my office around that. So I have big blankies and I have a furry carpet that you can take your shoes off and sink your feet into and pull your feet up onto my couch. And when I'm dealing with losses, I absolutely become a lot more sensitive.
I love that. And so for the listeners who are highly sensitive, when we have grief, I've talked about this before in terms of just when we have more stressors going on, when we get over-aroused and overstimulated, our nervous systems are going to be a little bit more fragile. We may feel more vulnerable. So the things that Jill is talking about with a non-highly sensitive person are going to become heightened in a highly sensitive person. And so it's just really important to take good care. And we'll be talking about ways that we can help towards the end of this interview, but I just wanted to say that up front. Jill, can you tell the listeners a little bit about why you do the work you do and why it's important? And maybe we can just straight off the bat dispel some of the misconceptions about grief, because my fear that I told you before we started recording is that listeners will see grief and put their fingers in their ears and go like, la, 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 I can't hear you.
Yeah, and people do that when they're coming to my speaking engagements, and then they find out we laugh all the way through it. So I do this work because I worked for hospice for a very long time, and I did both pediatric and adult hospice. I've also been widowed twice, and now I'm married to a funeral director, so that's the other side of it. And what I found was people didn't do grief well. And in fact, when I was widowed the first time, the first therapist I saw said she didn't know what to do with me. And then asked me, if I wake up tomorrow morning and everything is better, what would it be like? Which, as a therapist, we call the grief question. And you don't use that with a griever. It doesn't work. There's only one answer. Since then, I have seen so many clients come through my door here. And I saw so many through hospice before and after a loss thinking that You had to have stages. And if you didn't do the stages, you weren't doing it right. And being pushed around by people around them, being told how to do their grief. And that's not how I see it. There's a lot of losses on our planet. We lose people in our lives, we lose pets, we move, we get married, we get divorced, we change jobs. There's so many losses. And I want people to know how to do loss, and I want therapists to know how to do loss in a way that's supportive and constructive and allows people to set their own boundaries and to do it their way.
I love that. And I think that people think about grief in terms of heaviness, and it can be very intense work. And if you're already someone who has deep feelings and struggles with managing your emotions, what happens when people experience loss and they don't do the work? What are the symptoms that you see?
When people don't do the work, the way I look at that is not finishing the relationship, especially when it's about a death. There are the woulda, coulda, shouldas left over. And there's a need to remember someone as perfect and angelic as opposed to realistic. And sometimes that gets imposed upon them as well by people around them. And they get stuck. So they don't ever get to finish it. They don't get to look at what was left undone. And they don't get to finish up with the resentments that they're still holding. So they stay reactive. And they're far more subject to depression, and they're far less likely to thrive because they haven't finished, so they stick there. And every time they are triggered, the same kind of trigger level occurs because they're still right at the time of the loss, as opposed to having really looked at who died, what's changed, what they want to do with their life now with whatever this change is, and how they want to be in charge of it and manage it and work around the shift and encompass it and keep the person who left in with them anyway. Whether it's somebody who physically left or someone who died, you still have them with you. But folks who are still in the active grief process who can't move past that, it's as if they're still waiting for them to come around the corner. And that's a totally different place to be emotionally.
Yeah, yeah. And my intention in doing this episode is that the holidays can be a lot for a highly sensitive person. They're overstimulating, it's over arousing. There's lots of expectations, lots of disappointments, and there's lots of anticipated loss, lots of actual loss. And so today we're going to be talking about not only death and grieving, but all the different ways that loss can show up. So Jill, can you talk about what some of those other losses might look like for people?
Well, I had some come in from your folks, and I also then expanded that with stuff that I hear all day long in my practice. People are looking at the loss of the kind of family they came from and wanting to see their family as they were instead of as they truly are. There are losses in terms of having moved, having had an illness this year, particularly those who've become less abled over the course of the year. We have people who have had losses because of the opioid epidemic, which has hit every community just hugely hard. And whether that's somebody who's just in the midst of substance abuse or someone who has died because of it, it's an equivalent kind of an experience of loss for that person because we can't compare losses. We have the losses that are those that we don't really traditionally look at as losses. Pets, for instance, who are just as important as people, absolutely as important as people. We have families that are expecting us to be too much, to attend too much, and we get caught up in that. We tend to lose ourselves in those moments. So there's a lot of different kind of losses we can have at holidays.
Yeah, definitely. What other losses are there?
Oh, financial. The grief can show up in wanting to be something that, or hold on to those things that used to be. Finances always play a part in terms of stress at the holidays for pretty much everybody. But for grievers, it's a sense of I have to repeat what used to be, even though what used to be isn't there, whether it's proximity or a change in your life or a change in terms of a loss of somebody in your life. There is a need to be part of everything that goes on around you, all that stuff you talked about in terms of the overstimulation. And some people can't do it, and they take that as a loss for themselves because they see themselves as being less because they can't manage or don't choose to manage and be part of all of the holiday craziness.
Mm-hmm.
To me, I think it's a whole lot healthier to choose which things you're going to be part of and which things you're not, because you don't have to be part of it. There are people who have retired or have lost friendships, people who've gotten married, and all of a sudden now they've got to figure out how to incorporate 2 different families or more families. In my family, I have all adopted children as well, and they all have relationships with their birth families to some degree or another, which I've always encouraged. So for us, we had a whole lot of figuring out how to make sure they had time with those family members as well as our family and how they wanted to work that out. And now with grandchildren in the family, I have to make sure that my daughter has time to have those kids spend time with their cousins from their birth side of the family. So there's a whole lot of negotiating that can create a sense of loss, because if you're going to add something, you might have to lose something else to make room for it. There's only so many days in November and December.
Right. And I think that we have these ideas about how we think we're supposed to show up, whatever your role is, mother, husband, partner, brother, sister, aunt, child, how we're supposed to show up and what a proper holiday looks like and how many people should be there and how much we should spend. And what happens is we often bump up against what happens in life, and it can really impact how the holiday goes because we have these expectations that are supposed to be like what we see on TV. And the reality is it really looks different for every family. And when we get to a point that we can recognize it, it's okay to do what works for me and my family. But I think that's where a lot of the stress comes in. What do you think about that?
I think we spend way too much time trying to be Hallmark
Mm-hmm.
and Instagram and other people's posts. We don't spend enough time looking at what's realistic for us. We know that none of that is actually real. I think it creates so much more stress for those who are trying to play the keep up part and the I need to have the perfect everything.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, to me, it really is such a stress maker. And it's hard to disengage from it because everywhere you go, there it is. You can't even walk into the grocery store right now without giant turkeys made out of stuffing boxes,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because it's early November. And I think we have to really be mindful of what we're able to tolerate, and to make sure that we are taking care of ourselves first so that we don't stretch ourselves too thin.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to be really transparent with you, Jill, and the listeners right now. Jill gave me an outline to make sure that we covered some things, because in the closed Facebook group that we have, Unapologetically Sensitive, a number of people provided some questions and things that they wanted to talk about. And I'm finding that I'm really having a hard time engaging in a meaningful conversation because my taskmaster wants to make sure that we're covering things. And it's making it really hard for me to feel like I'm having a genuine conversation. And it's really more important that you and I have a meaningful conversation and that the listeners
Absolutely.
get what they want. So, Jill, normally don't keep this in the recording, but just for the listeners, you kind of get to hear what goes on behind the scenes. I'm going to keep the sheet in front of me, but I can't even tell where we're at. And I want to be able to cover what you provided. And I don't know how to do that.
We're all over it. And I just wrote the outline for your listeners to hear so that I made sure that we covered some of the ideas that they wanted covered. And I think we have covered a lot of them actually already. The idea that the holidays for folks who are in the middle of addressing losses need to be about understanding what losses they've faced that year. So maybe looking back and taking note of that and looking at it really with a bigger mind about what loss means.
Mm-hmm.
And then being very self-aware so that we're not being so reactive to other people's expectations and our inner expectations, which are not realistic, so that we can set our own boundaries and make the holidays what we want them to be.
Right. And what I imagine some of the listeners doing or saying, and maybe I'm wrong, is like, I don't want to go back and look and revisit those losses and that hurt again. It just makes me really sad. And I just want to pretend like it's not there and move on. And what my experience is when I'm not able to name and acknowledge what's going on. And I think culturally this happens and individually this happens where we minimize what we're experiencing and then things don't work out and we don't know why. And so for me, I can see the value in looking at what happened and creating a lot of room and grace and self-love and self-acceptance and self-compassion to know that it may be a little bit bumpier this year. We may need to slow down. We may need to trim down. I mean, that's what I'm thinking. What do you have to say?
I absolutely agree. I think that if we can take note of the things that have changed, sometimes using even the word loss is too much for people. So what's changed this year about who I am and who's in my world? And how do I make sure that that gets acknowledged and honored, and that I don't try so hard to avoid looking at that I lose where I really want this end of the year to be and what I want it to include.
I really love that perspective of using the word change, because I was thinking some people will be going into the holidays not having a partner they were with, either due to a breakup or death, or if it's somebody who has dementia or is failing health, or somebody who has a new partner. Again, that's negotiating whose house do we spend it at? What's important to you? What's important to me? All of those changes, especially if you're highly sensitive, are going to create more for us. And so the more we can talk about it and be aware, the more ease that we can create. And I really want to dispel that fear that I'm anticipating people thinking like, I don't want to talk about it. It makes it worse. But when we don't talk about it, I mean, I will replay, but if you listen to the episode that I did of I lost my shirt on Thanksgiving last year, it was really bad. It was really, really bad. And I talk about specifically what happened in the episode. I am going to replay it probably on Thanksgiving with an update. But that is a perfect example of what happened of having 9 kids, not 9 kids. I had extra kids in my house for 9 days around Thanksgiving and didn't know what I needed and didn't take care of myself. And I totally lost my shirt on Thanksgiving with everybody here. It was not pretty.
I can imagine. I sort of. I really, I got to tell you, I lost my first wife on Good Friday, and I had kids in the house, and all their friends' parents thought it'd be a good idea to have a sleepover the next day.
Oh, Lordy.
So it was the night before Easter, and I realized I had to have baskets for 8 children, and I didn't. And I can't imagine that at Thanksgiving, I probably dropped the turkey.
Oh, goodness.
I would probably do that.
Yeah. Well, no, I just lost my cool over something very minor and yelled a big expletive out loud. And it was, like I said, it was not one of my finer moments. And that's what happens. And we deal with it and we move forward.
Right.
Yeah.
And we do better the next time, knowing that we now know what our stress tolerance is at the holidays. And it doesn't include extra people for extended periods of time.
No.
Perhaps.
No, and I lost my dedicated working space, and I was, anyways, if you want to listen to the episode,
I certainly will.
It's a bonus episode that's early on. I'll put it in the show notes if I remember, but it's called I Lost My Shirt on Thanksgiving or something like that. What are some other things that we can talk about that will help listeners identify things that might come up, ways that changes might be impacting them?
You know, when I talk to our staff here at our office and the holidays are coming up, I sound a little weird to the newbies, especially, because what I say is the holidays are coming. It's my favorite time of the year for grief. Mm-hmm. And they look at me like, you have most certainly lost your mind, but we knew that about you already. I say, no, that's because that's the one time that we know that this is going to come up and we can do something positive with it. And so I go out and I buy a bunch of little wooden ornaments for the kiddos that we have in the office. And we do ornaments or make things to hang on the Hanukkah candles to acknowledge what changes have occurred in our lives, openly talking about it. And we're talking about the good things about the things that have changed. So if somebody has died, we talk about the funny memories of them. And then when those kids take those things home and put them up around the house, it makes people engage with them in terms of talking about it, naming it, and remembering the good things. some of the sad things, the funny things, sometimes the wicked things, but it generates conversation as opposed to the silence that goes around when we have things that have changed and we're trying so hard not to talk about them. It helps to have reminders to talk about those things. So I look forward to the holidays for that, because I think if we can, and I know actually, if we take stock of what's changed and we name it and we do a little writing about it, and then we include those things in how we plan our holiday season, we can include those things that we want to and not have them catch us up short. The other thing that happens with the holidays is sometimes there are anniversaries or birthdays for folks who have absented themselves or died or that we've moved from. And those people need to be included too, so that we don't look at the calendar or have a Facebook reminder come through.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden we're caught up short, because social media is sometimes unkind at this time of year.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, just as we're talking, I'm kind of reframing, and you and I talked before we started recording that you and I have a very similar background, and I've worked in the health field. I've worked in hospitals and home health. I have dealt with death and grief and hospice. So it's something I'm very familiar with, but I really haven't thought about talking about it in terms of change as opposed to loss. I mean, there is loss, but I think that I love that reframe of change. And talking about the memories and finding ways to honor the people that are no longer with us for whatever reason. They're not with us because they've had a change in mental status, because they're declining, because we've lost them to death or to a relationship change or whatever it is. That I think that really puts a whole different way of even conceptualizing this thing that we call grief.
It does. And in terms of the new relationships and the negotiating those, there may be people in the life of your new partner that you didn't know about. There may have been losses that you were unaware of that are important to them that they never brought up for whatever reason, or that they didn't tell you just how much of an impact it had on them. And this is a time to be able to bring those people forward and to figure out how your partner wants to include them and how they are included in your partner's family. It gives you a sense of the traditions that you're walking into that you may not be aware of. It's a learning experience.
I love that. So can we brainstorm some questions that if somebody's in a relationship and they're like, I don't even know what to say. Like, what do I say? Is there anybody that died that you want to talk about?
See, that would be a Jill thing to say, because I'm a little snarky like that.
It would be a Patricia thing to say too, because I'm pretty cut to the chase. But can we maybe help the listeners come up with some language and some ideas of how they might start a conversation that would invite that to be discussed?
I would perhaps say something like, is there someone that you've had in your world that has died, 4-footer or 2-footer, that you'd like to include on our tree or in our Thanksgiving, blessings or thank yous or whatever tradition your family has? And you talk about those before that day. Most families do have that thing where you stand around and, think of something you're thankful for, or talk about the things you're thankful for around the dinner table on Thanksgiving. That's something that you can talk about ahead of time, so that if they are not going to include them, you can bring them up so that the rest of that family knows you're aware of and that they're important to that family.
I love that. That's great.
I'd also maybe say, tell me about your old pets. Tell me who they were. That always generates these conversations.
Yeah, definitely.
Always. Yeah.
I want to repeat the first thing that you said, and I will put these in the show notes. So if you want to get these in writing, if you go to unapologeticallysensitive.com, go to the podcast page and click on this episode with Jill. And if you listen in iTunes, it'll be right there. But what Jill said is there someone you've had in your world that died that you'd like to include in the blessing or in part of our holiday celebration? Or asking about pets, and especially for highly sensitive people. I mean, it's for anybody. But because our pets provide so much unconditional love, and because we walk around in the world with such an awareness of subtleties, the relationship that we have with our pets, especially as highly sensitive people, man, when we lose them, they're hard for everybody. But I would venture to say that for an HSP, it can really be difficult because that's just so much unconditional love.
I would bet so. And I have seen that. I do grief loss counseling for people who have lost their pets. And I would probably say that they would fall into an HSP kind of a description. And those pet losses are huge. I keep little pet charms so that when we finish, I send them home with one
Oh, I love that.
to acknowledge the loss, because pets count as much as people.
Absolutely. So Buster is walking by the front door with his owner, Matt. Gracie's on my lap. I can't keep her quiet, so you're just going to get what you get. So everybody can say, hey, Buster, how's it going?
Hi, Buster. Adele's asleep on my floor right now.
Okay, Gracie. Thank you. Thank you, Gracie. Thank you. Oh, there was something that I wanted to say about what you said, and I just got so distracted with the dogs. Do you recall the last sentence or two that you said?
To be honest, no.
Okay.
Gone.
Yeah, I know. Isn't it great being middle-aged?
Not always. Especially not when you get hot in the middle of the night.
I know. So
that's just lousy.
We know that we love our pets, and pets are incredibly meaningful to us. I know what it was that I was going to say, that I think oftentimes people do not identify with how much the loss of a pet can mean, and that often people who lose a pet either identify with how much it means, or they minimize it because they feel like it's not okay to have as much sadness over the loss. And again, I really think that there's something about, again, this is anecdotal, but for a highly sensitive person, we're much more in tune with animals and nature. So we often have really special connections. We get unconditional love from our pets. It's the one relationship where we're loved no matter what. And so it's really a big loss. And it can be very challenging to navigate when people don't understand why somebody wants to take a day off of work because they lost a pet.
I've written letters for people because I think that when you have lost someone who's your fur footer and those big brown eyes are not there to look at, you've lost the one person you can talk to who will never share what you've said, the one who will always be there and wag their tail or purr. Even cats who are highly independent love their people and provide that sense of security and love, and I'm always going to be there for you. And absolutely, we don't give anybody more than 3 days off for bereavement. We should do the same for pet loss because they count like a person does.
Yeah, yeah. And you've written a book specifically about this. Why don't you tell us about your book?
Yeah, I wrote a book about a pet getting sick and needing to be euthanized, and the experience of a child in walking through that, as well as the afterward and the feelings and coping with that afterward, and how to honor that pet's life for the rest of your life. And I wrote it in part because our veterinarian asked me to, because veterinarians are facing a tremendous amount of stress too. They are, by and large, some of the most amazing people, and they love their little patients. We're not their patients, the pets are. And when they lose one, it's hard for them. And so I wrote the book to help people prepare their kids for that moment, as well as to help them talk about the loss afterward. And it's got helps for big people in the back. All of my children's grief books do, because kids do grief way better than adults do. We learn to not do grief well when parents teach us not to do it well as children.
Right. There's something about this whole no talk rule that, and I've been debating whether I wanted to share this or not. I'm going to make it very brief, but this illustrates why our culture is about don't talk. There's a thread in a very large group that has 130,000 members, and the question was about a college student. The son breaks off with the girlfriend, and should the mother reach out to the girlfriend? Because the girlfriend took family vacations, was part of the family. And I would say that at least 80% of the answers are no, leave it alone. And the projection is that the son will not feel supported and that the girlfriend will have false hope that, they're going to get back together. And, I mean, this has bothered me so much. I talked to my husband.
Ugh.
I reached out to my son and his girlfriend and said, what do you guys think about this? Because it just, that whole projection of those are real relationships, and whether they're together or not, a person can support the son and reach out to the girlfriend and say, gosh, I feel really sad. I've loved this connection that we've had you as part of our family. And this to me just epitomizes our whole don't talk about things, don't mess with it, what do you have to say before I go on and on?
Oh, absolutely. That's a trigger for me, and I don't know why, other than I work with people who have had a major loss and were not officially married or had been divorced already. And it's kind of the same reaction from the vast majority of the population is, but that's not really your loss. You weren't you weren't important enough. I think when our kids have a very important relationship and it breaks off, I might ask the permission of my child to reach out, but I certainly would, and I have, in fact, to significant people in my children's lives after their relationships break up. And I've said, I really value you, and I would be happy to have you maintain some kind of relationship. I understand you're going to want to go do your own thing, but we're always here. And I, in fact, maintain friendships with some of their parents still.
Right.
Because they've become part of our family fabric.
Right. It's almost like there's this rule, the external rule of, divorce breakup means no contact and that it doesn't impact what's happened internally. But we have meaningful relationships and connections with people, and those people and animals are in our hearts. And just because the relationship ends on the outside doesn't mean that those people and relationships aren't in our hearts. And I think, again, a little bit more of a bias for someone who's highly sensitive, that those connections are really important and meaningful, and to find ways to honor that, I think, is so important, and to talk about it. And like I saw in this group, and I actually saw a few therapists that it's not a therapist group, but I saw at least one therapist is like, nope, leave it alone. And
oh my gosh.
I got a little judgy.
Yeah.
I got very judgy.
I'm proud of you. I think this whole no talk thing, it's so endemic. One of our poodles, we have poodles here in our office. They're on our website. They live with me at home, and we call them the Oodles. And one of them was 17 and a half, and we lost her this year. We put up a little memorial at the office, and everybody, all of our clients had come to know her over the years. We all had our moments and talk about it, but now we have people come back after so many months, and they weren't aware that she died. And they'll say, oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to bring it up. I don't want to make you sad. And there's the rule.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody here has learned to counter it with, no, we really appreciate that you remember her and that you say her name and that she was a part of your life. And there's her picture still, and she'll always be part of CCS, our agency. And when people die, or when we lose people, or when relationships end, we need to still talk about those people, including the 4-foot people, because they're still part of our hearts and who we are, and they help shape us.
Yeah, I think where it gets really difficult is if we have a partner who their family did not talk about feelings and they're not inclined to go there, it can make it really tricky for the other partner if they're inclined to talk about it, because you kind of get the message from the partner that they really don't want to go there, and you don't want to push too much, but you know that it's going on. What would you say to someone who's in that type of a relationship?
I try to bring them in together, and I push a little.
Mm-hmm.
And what I find is that the tears are right there,
mm-hmm.
and they've just never been allowed to work it through.
Mm-hmm.
And they really wanted to, but they never had permission.
Yeah.
Because feelings were not something where permission was granted. I don't push too hard, and it may take weeks. Or if the partner won't come in, I work with the one that does have the feelings and wants the other one to share the feelings. And I give them some pointers, like we talked about earlier, ways to bring up the loss so that it becomes part of the fabric of the conversation at home. Make sure there's a picture up. Make sure that there's some way to acknowledge that so that eventually the conversation can happen. And I also tell the one that I'm seeing, you can say, you know what, I understand you're uncomfortable with feelings, but I really need you to know this matters to me. And I do have these feelings, and I do need to let them out. And I'd really appreciate some support for that. And maybe we can help you find why it's important to me.
Could we come up with some language that for somebody that it maybe doesn't warrant going to therapy, or the partner wouldn't go to therapy, but can we come up with some ways that people could language that if they are in a relationship with someone who's had a loss and the person, is just like, I'm fine, I don't want to talk about it. What could somebody say to generate a conversation?
I like to go into what part of them is always going to be part of you.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Because that's how we take those people with us into our lives. Who were they to us? And what part of them, what lessons did you learn from them? And how did they impact your life? Because those are the things that are always going to be there. That generates the conversations. And it is a reality. When we are reorganizing after a major loss, one of the ways we organize is to figure out where that person's going to fit, because we never, ever stop talking to someone who's left our lives. We just do it in our heads.
Say a little bit more about that.
Well, if you think about when someone has died and you have a relationship around a particular something, it's cooking or cars or the yard. I'm out in the yard and I'm taking care of my roses. That's going to bring up me talking to my first wife because we loved roses together. And nobody else does. I'm married to a funeral director. They don't do flowers. And so I will talk to Linda while I'm tending to my roses because that's part of my relationship with her. She is quite gone. She's not here, but she's still someone that I converse with. Does that make sense?
It does. I absolutely love it. And I'm going to jump back to something. I just wanted you to go deeper into that when you said it. So I want to go back and repeat what you had said of ways that a partner can bring up loss. And I just have to say my gremlins are going like, you're not being very linear right now. And I'm not. And I keep thinking that I should be. And if you've listened to the podcast from the beginning, you know that this is how I am. But
I don't do linear very well.
I think I still have this belief that I should be linear, and I'm very persistent, and I love to get a point across, and I'll go back to it, but I am just not linear, and I keep thinking that I should be.
No.
Maybe that's,
I'll give you permission not to.
Maybe that's something to work on for the holidays.
Yes.
So if you have a partner that has a hard time talking about a loss, some of the things that Jill said is, what part of this person is always going to be a part of you? What are lessons that you learned from this person? How did this person impact your life? I just love that. And I think that we really do talk to people. It's interesting. When I started doing private practice, I did in-home counseling. And I worked with a client that I had a very deep, meaningful connection with. It had very healthy boundaries. It was very appropriate just for anybody who's, losing your shirt right now. And she had a number of illnesses. And at one point we thought that she may die from one illness. And it kind of brought up this thing of like, would I go to her funeral as a therapist? There's controversy if people say, how do you know the person? So I asked her about it. I said, if you were to die, would you want me to go to your funeral? She's like, oh yeah, with some swearing in there. And I said, and if people come up to me and say, how do I know you? What do you want me to say? She says, tell them you're my therapist. And she thought about it some more and she says, I want you to speak at my funeral.
Wow, what an honor.
Well, yes, it was. And so she ended up recovering from this thing that we thought may have killed her. And so we were really relieved. And then something else came up and she died very unexpectedly. And this loss really hit me hard. I mean, I've had lots of clients die. I've worked with lots of death. And I'm not saying that that I wasn't impacted by them. But this death in particular really hit me hard. And I did speak at her funeral. Her family was there. I think it was a great source of comfort to them. I ended up going to a ceramics place and bought this huge tray and painted it and put her initials on it. And it's where I keep my daily watches and jewelry. So every day I see it and think of her. And when I go through times of stress, like I talked to her, she was someone that I loved working with. We had a really unique relationship. And because she was a little older than I was, the things that we talked about were really meaningful. And so I love that what you were talking about is we can talk to people that have died anytime we need to, and we can bring in their wisdom and know how they would respond to us. I mean, that at least that's my belief. Do you have anything to say about that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There was a social worker named Leo Buscaglia who was a professor at USC.
I love Leo.
Don't you love him? Right? The Fall of Freddie the Leaf. But there's a quote that he has that I can't do exactly, but basically says, the people that we love never and die never leave our lives. They're always part of who we reflect on, how we are and who we are. Their love lives on in us. And when we do have those people who touch us especially, they should continue to be part of our lives. I've heard the controversies about therapists attending funerals, and I tend to roll my eyes like I am right now. Because if you mattered that much to a client and they want you there, then in their honor, in my humble opinion, you should be there. And I work with a lot of folks who are chronically to terminally ill, so it's not an unusual conversation for me. I think we should be able to remember them. I have little things in my office from some of those folks. And when I spot them and it's one of those days and they cross my mind, it brings a smile and a bit of their wisdom and their wit back to me. And that's important. That's a part of who made me what I am. they're never going to be out of my head, and I'm certainly wouldn't want to be.
Right. And I think it really breaks that misconception that as therapists, we can have relationships with our clients that are very well boundaried, very healthy, very appropriate. And because we do depth work, we impact our clients impact us. It's about the relationship. And that's really where change comes from. And I have to say that after I shared what I did, I had a little bit of a shame attack. And I went like, oh my gosh, and imagined the therapist, going like, oh my gosh, you have no boundaries. And so I kind of had to process that, which motivated what I said. So I want to be very transparent. And I honestly believe that we can have meaningful relationships that are healthy and boundaried and be impacted both ways in our relationships with clients. Not all of them, but many of our clients, and there's nothing wrong with that.
No, I mean, they're obviously professional boundaries. I am not Facebook friends, or I don't do social events with clients. But when there's been a client who's mattered a lot and who has made that request, it, in my humble opinion, should be honored. And the family clearly knows, especially if someone has been very ill. Typically, the family's been part of transporting the client to my office, and you did in-home work, so you were in their home. It's not a surprise that we exist.
Right.
And many times our clients will talk about us with their friends and family as well, and the work they're doing. So I think, we do keep the professional boundaries, but clients do touch us, and that should be part of what we acknowledge. Otherwise, you're not doing good therapy if you don't have that therapeutic relationship.
Yeah.
That's where the work comes from.
Yeah. Jill, I'm wanting to move into some of the tips that people can use, but I'm wondering if there's anything that we need to cover before we move into that. Is there any other foundation or things that we haven't talked about?
One of the things that somebody brought up was, and which is typical when I'm doing presentations on grief, is a fear of a death occurring. And I just wanted to say, for those folks who are carrying that fear, one of the very best ways to deal with it is to get some education about what that looks like, what that process is like, when and if, because loss happens no matter what we do on this planet. When and if that moment comes and you are there, you know what you're seeing and you're aware of it, and it doesn't catch you off guard or scare you. I would hope that you'd find a way to get some of that education ahead of time so that it can allay some of that for you.
I have a feeling that the question came from Anne Catherine Walter, and I have her permission to use her name. So she's very afraid about her mom dying. I have the same fear. My mom lives with me. I cry and I tell her this all the time. And my husband, I also talk about it. Like he's got to go. He's got to go after me because I don't think I can manage without him. Part of what happens with highly sensitive people is the way that our brains are wired, and I can't speak to it intelligently right now, is we anticipate things, and it's a strength, and it's something that can work against us. And my guess is that her question is more about, how am I going to manage that if I struggle with having big feels right now when there's no loss, and this is someone that's significant to me, how am I going to manage with that loss when it happens? And I think her question was more about the emotional side of it than the practical nuts and bolts.
I appreciate that. So that's when we prepare ourselves ahead of time, so that as you are able to anticipate better than most, then you do the reorganizing in your head for what life will be like without that very significant person front and center and present in present time. Because they're still going to be with you in your head. They're still going to be with you emotionally. Because particularly moms make us who we are. I mean, that's why moms are always the blame too, right? It's always mom's fault. And it'll be mom's fault that folks are going to grieve so much for moms. But if we prepare for life with mom not being present, and what that's going to look like and how that's going to change, and what things we can do to bring them with us and to honor them in our new life without them present, it tends to take down the fear of the unknown, because you're already reorganizing around that concept. That also reduces depression in a loss.
And what I was thinking is, because I've talked to my mom about how fearful I am about her dying. She's healthy. There's no reason to indicate that she's going to be dying anytime soon. There's a plan, and I don't know what it is, but she's not ill. So for me, I don't think I want to go too far down the road of, how am I going to plan for it? But what I was thinking when you were talking is, it's almost like with a young child of reminding them when they're going to do something scary about how, like if they're going to separate from us, how we go with them. And so it was almost the same thing of how can I reassure myself that my mom will always be in my heart? Her voice is always going to be in my soul and spirit. And so when I have those fearful thoughts, to know that, I don't know what it's going to be like when she does die. And these are the things that are going to continue to stay with me. And that may create some more reassurance.
Mm-hmm. It's packing in the memories and the special stuff ahead of time.
Yeah.
When I was little and we went off to summer camp, of course, the first time you go, it's a little scary. You're going to be gone for 5 to 7 days. Parents are excited. Kids are afraid. And so something my mom used to do, which I continued with my kids, is we did a pillowcase. And everybody who was significant signed that pillowcase for the 2 weeks prior to camp and put a little note on it, said something to us. The cats put their paw prints on it and their names on it. So did the dog. That way, when you got to camp, you had that with you. And I think that's sort of along the same lines. It's very simplistic, but it's taking those thoughts and making sure they're always there.
I love that.
And I still have those pillowcases.
Aww. I'm not advocating that anybody do this specifically, but my son, who has a very strong attachment to my mother and is wired very much like I am, talked to me about wanting to get a tattoo when she died to memorialize her. And I'm like, why don't you talk to her about that now, of what that would look like? And he decided that he wanted to get one now. And he and my mom doesn't, she thinks that it's like defacing your body when you get a tattoo. She's like, could you get something monogrammed? And I could see that he was struggling. And I said, is it because like if you get a watch or something, it can break, you can lose it? And he's like, yeah. So he really wants that sense of permanence on his body to remind him of the incredibly special relationship that he has with my mom. And so he got this peacock feather because my mom loves peacocks. And I just think it's such a beautiful way, and to be able to have that honor now while she's still alive, as opposed to waiting until after she died.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I'm so glad that he did that.
Yeah.
And I hope she can see it's nicer than a monogram.
I think she's just from that generation where, you don't do stuff to your body and it's permanent.
Yeah.
She's very respectful. And I think it really meant a lot to her that it's significant of the relationship that they share together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. My kids have several tattoos in honor of parents they've lost.
Aww.
And when you look at them, you can just see that connection. One has a sea turtle, which meant very much something to both of the moms. So, yeah, I think those are important to do.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so let's talk about ways that people can manage during the holidays.
During the holidays. Okay, so here's Jill's magic list, because this is what I talk about, and it's also what I do. So I am not just speaking from a therapist chair. This is from the Jill chair, too.
Okay.
First, we plan ahead. Because if you look at the calendar, I've got one in front of me right now, and I can see how many days I've got till Thanksgiving. And you look at what you want to spend from now until the first of the year, because it's not just Christmas or Hanukkah, it's also Thanksgiving and it's other things. How much have you really got? And how much energy do you have? And how much of a reserve do you have to tolerate the onslaught of 50 days of Hallmark movies, for instance?
Which many of us HSPs actually love.
I bet. But they also set up expectations that are so not realistic.
They do. It's just that we know that nothing terrible is going to happen, but there are some terrible implicit biases in them, which I'm recognizing. But please go ahead.
Yeah. I'm actually one of those who does watch them, and HGTV, because I can't tolerate stress during TV or movie watching.
Lifetime is running Christmas movies now, and they have a little bit more of an edge to them, but nothing dangerous. So,
maybe I'll have to investigate those.
Yeah, there you go.
Thank you for the tip.
Sure.
I also tell my folks who are really dreading holidays, and this goes for everything in the year, Mother's Day in particular comes up, is avoid the stores. You can have anything you need delivered. You can get your groceries delivered this afternoon. You can do all the shopping you need to do online. So if walking into a store is going to trigger too much for you, don't go in. Nobody says you have to step in and face that turkey made out of boxes or whatever the case may be. So make sure that you're not putting yourself in a position to stress yourself out. I also look at what the activities are. In my tribe, there are a ton of activities that can come up during the holidays. What I look at and what I look at with my clients is, which ones do you really have to participate in? Which ones do you want to participate because it's a heart place for you? And which ones, when you think about them, cause you nothing but, oh, I don't want to do it, because you don't have to. You can say no. If you're going to go, take your own car. That way you can leave. Don't carpool. No carpooling during the holidays, unless you're with somebody else who's of like mind, because then they're a good excuse. I have to get somebody home, right? When you get somewhere, look for your exit. Something I also do with anxiety clients. You're in a position of walking into a group event. There's Christmas lights, there's songs, there's people, there's small people, there's older people. How am I going to get out of here if it gets to be too much? Or if I feel too emotional? Or if I feel like I'm going to burst into tears? Where do I go so I don't have to be there? And I also do a lot of teaching about what I call the grief card. Do you ever use that technique?
I don't know what it is.
It's like the ultimate ace of spades.
Okay, tell me.
So the grief card is, I'm grieving right now. And you look at someone straight in the eye when they say, why aren't you going? Or why aren't you staying? I'm grieving right now. This is not something that fits for me.
Oh, this is like the cancer card. Got it.
Yeah, it's mine. You can't argue with someone who says, I'm grieving, right?
Got it.
Or I'm on chemo. No, I got to go.
I thought there was like a literal grief card, and I'm like, I don't know what that is, and I feel like I should. I was
Yeah, I'm going to have a grief card. I'm actually making one now. I don't quite know what the artwork needs to be, but just put it on the table. Literally, I can't. I'm grieving. You can't make me. They won't, because they're kind of afraid of what you might do. Are you going to burst into tears and make us all sad? Are you going to fall apart? If you're saying you're grieving and you can't go, you just stay away, right? Likewise, I work on practicing boundaries ahead of time. If someone is going to be pressured into doing something, spending something, being somewhere, how do you say no? And how do you say it in a way that that particular person that you're concerned about is going to listen to you? And when I look at that with folks, it's, what is your relationship to this person? Because you can always pull rank if they are younger or one of your kiddos. Or is it somebody you really need to be deferential to? So, for instance, mom or one of the church ladies or temple ladies. You got to have a certain deference. Or is it a coworker, in which case you can just sort of lay it on the line? But how are you going to set that boundary so that nobody crosses it, so that your needs are being respected and you don't have to explain them? Because you don't have to say why you don't want to do something. You need to be able to just say no in a way that's going to work for them, and then practice that. That's what car rearview mirrors are for, and bathroom mirrors are for. You practice the no's, you practice the boundaries so that you've got it down cold, so that if you're caught up short somewhere, you can use that boundary and lay it down and be done. Right?
I love that.
I also like to give everybody, including myself, permission to change it up. I used to actually host Thanksgiving and Christmas at my house, and they averaged about 35 people in the group. And I finally went, you know what? I don't have to do both. First of all, it's expensive, and second, it's exhausting.
Mm-hmm.
I love the holiday. I just don't want to do it. So we're leaving on the 26th for Laughlin, Nevada, and we're going to go spend 4 days by the river, and someone else is going to cook, and it's going to cost less than feeding 35 people an elegant meal, and I don't got to do dishes, and it takes the stress off of me.
I love that. This year, because one of my sons is away at college and he's only able to come home for one full day, I really got clear, and especially after my delightful behavior last Thanksgiving, that I really want to have just our family here, our immediate family. And so what we're going to do with the extended family that traditionally comes over is that on Saturday, we'll have them over for pie and coffee and time to spend with them, because I really want to do this. And so now I'm going to have to tell my family before this episode airs because I'm kind of avoiding it.
I really love that. And I used to do group texts or group emails to prepare people for change. And I did that for this one. Like, this is how it's going to be. If you want to come to Laughlin, you can. But that means we're just going to meet up for occasional meals. I'm not going to hang out with you the whole time.
So does that mean that I could send a text instead of making a phone call? Because I've been in a really introverted place, and part of it is like I just don't want to make phone calls. So it's okay to do it by text?
I would do text. I would do email. I would do a group Facebook note. Yep. I like those kinds of things.
Yay.
When my wives were dying, I wrote a blog so people knew what was going on. So I didn't have to tell anyone. You want to know? Read the blog.
Okay, I'm going to be sending out a text as soon as we finish recording today. I'm a little embarrassed. Like, it's so easy to help other people set boundaries, and when it comes to our own stuff, sometimes it can be really challenging. But I want to make sure you get through your list. So
that's fine. We're almost there. I do want to say there's a therapist who has an online therapist store, and she has a T-shirt on that says "Setting Boundaries like I do it for a living."
I love that.
I'm going to wear that for a family event. I want people to make sure they don't include people who don't feel good in their space, but do include the people who they've lost. And don't forget the critters. The pets got to be there. Be prepared if there are anniversaries coming, birthdays coming, like we already talked about. Make sure you're planning for it. Then you're not caught up short by it. Remember, too, that New Year's comes after all the others. And New Year's is a trigger point if you've got losses, especially deaths. Because at New Year's, every single flipping TV channel has to have a year-end list of who died, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's sports or celebrities or whatever, they got to have it. And none of our people are on that list. And for people, especially who are sensitive or have had recent losses, that feels so invalidating because their loss is way more important than a celebrity to them. It's hard to watch those, so mind your TV watching, so that you're not putting yourself in a position where you might be hurt. Right now, especially this time of year, journaling is a fabulous way to cope and prepare and to have some insight for next year all at the same time. You can do some gratitude journaling, which, why am I happy I woke up this morning? What's good about the day? What am I looking forward to? But also, what worked in terms of preparing today? What worked on this particular holiday, what felt good and what didn't. Because if something didn't work or didn't feel good, then you can change it up for next year. If you're not writing it down, unless you're Patricia, who does an entire show about losing her shirt on Thanksgiving.
And everybody knows about it.
You're not going to remember it, right? Because it goes to the back of our brains. And we kind of go, okay, well, that wasn't that bad. Write it down in the moment, so that you don't repeat it. I love that you are limiting people. So you got your time with your kiddo. You should have that. You also need to get some sunshine during this time of year because that is a stress buster. And get some walking in if you're able to. Move your body in some way. Do it in a place that's comfortable for you. In Riverside, California, where I live, we have this fabulous mountain called Mount Rubidoux, and it's got all these historic things on it. It's a great walking path. It takes about an hour and a half if you're not in a hurry. Everybody up there is smiling. There are dogs to pet. We also have the Festival of Lights, which is the biggest one in the United States now. And 1.5 million people show up in one night to watch lights get turned on and fireworks.
That is not necessarily an HSP's idea of a quiet, intimate evening.
Absolutely not. So if I've got someone who has to be there, I give them some ideas on where they can go so they're not caught in the crowd.
Mm-hmm.
But if they'd rather have the quiet, go at Mount Rubidoux. You can see all the lights anyway, or do your own special thing. But find some ways to enjoy yourself and not put yourself in a position where you're going to be overwhelmed. Does that make sense?
I love it. Those are great ideas. I love it.
My final thing that I would add is this year we're adding Wolfenoot to our family, which is a new holiday. It was put together by a kid in New Zealand. And it's on November 23rd. It's a completely made-up thing, but it's to honor the pets in our lives and the wild creatures that we value. And I think for a group that really connects with animals, it's kind of a cool thing to do. So if you want to look it up, it's a nice little area. It's based on being kind to animals and to be celebrating those who are kind to animals.
And if I'm able to, I'll put a link. I saw what you posted on Facebook and I read it and it was really delightful. So if I'm able to link to anything in the show notes, I will do that as well.
Oh, great. So that would be my list. The prep, be ready, don't overwhelm yourself. Those are the bottom lines.
Yeah. And I really love the idea of finding ways to honor people or situations or things that we've lost. And really, for me, because I'm very concrete, finding tangible ways to, whether it's if you celebrate Christmas, an ornament or something to put in your home. I know everybody celebrates lots of different things. So I want to be very mindful that I'm not saying that the only holiday that there is Christmas, but whatever you celebrate, finding a way to memorialize and commemorate someone can really be meaningful.
Absolutely. They make Hanukkah candles now, candle holders with a pet's face on them. And I think that's a great way to do things. And there's all kinds of ways, all of these festivals and holidays, to remember those that are no longer here and to include them.
Yeah.
Because they're here anyway, we should make sure we say them out loud.
Right. Right. And it really does change the whole thing from sadness and loss and grief and that idea of heaviness into really it's about change and memories and finding a way to honor the people and animals that we've lost, the relationships that have changed, and to carry all of those things in our heart moving forward. And it really, I'm not minimizing that grief isn't difficult and that the grief process can't be, we got to go through it. And to kind of put a new way of thinking about it, that, those people are always in our hearts and it creates richness to our lives, and those memories are still with us, and those people move forward with us, even if they're not here with their physical presence.
In grief, we never let go and we never move on. We take them with us.
Yeah. Yeah. Gosh, that's so beautiful. Jill, I am so grateful that you were willing to come on with me, especially last minute, so we can get this episode out before the holidays hit.
Thank you for having me. It's been delightful.
Jill, tell us where we can find you. Tell us the names of your books. I will put them in the show notes. Yeah.
Okay.
Tell people where we can connect.
You can find me at www.yourpaththroughgrief.com. I know it's a lot of words, but it was the best I could come up with at the time. My books are on Amazon under Jill Johnson Young. I have a book called Someone I Love is Sick, I Have to Say Goodbye. I have one on pet loss called My Pet is Sick, It's Time to Say Goodbye. And I have one for children after a death, Someone I Love Just Died, What Happens Now, which talks about all of the rituals that happen after a death and how to cope with grief. And then I have an adult workbook, because I do actually work with adults too. And it's called Your Own Path Through Grief, and it's solution focused, which is what I am in terms of working through the loss, working through the leftovers, remembering them for who they are, and taking them with us. I'm also on Facebook and LinkedIn and all those other social media places. I'm very findable.
And just to say that you and I are not related, although we do share the name Young in common.
We do. That was my first wife's name. So yes, it's a good one. Thank you for sharing it with me.
Well, Jill, thank you so much for being here today. I really love this conversation that we had, and I'm really hoping that it will change the way that people think about grief and loss as opposed to memories and carrying people forward with us.
Me too.
All right. Have a great day.
You too.
All right. Bye-bye. Hey again. So I'm curious to know what you thought of the episode. I thought it was really powerful, and I've realized that I have an idea of who the listener is, and so I often feel very protective, and I'm really wondering if I don't have a very good sense of who you are as a listener and what you're capable of. If you're comfortable reaching out to me, I would love to hear how this episode landed with you. My fear is that it felt overwhelming, and the talk of grief maybe would prevent people from listening to it. Like I said, I think it's an amazing episode, and I would love to get your feedback about it. My hope is coming up soon. I'm going to get a survey out so I can get a better sense of the demographics of you, the listener, and things that you're interested in. It will just help me moving forward. The online HSP courses are going to be starting again mid-January. I'm going to be having more clips and some episodes coming out about it. They've been really powerful, and I'm going to be slipping in some little audio clips of people who have taken the courses talking about them in the upcoming episodes. If you're curious to know anything about them, you can go to unapologeticallysensitive.com and go to the HSP groups page. If you have any feedback for me, please feel free to reach out to me at unapologeticallysensitive@gmail.com. I have lots of social media posts on Pinterest, Instagram, YouTube. You can go to my website at unapologeticallysensitive.com if you're interested in getting more information about the highly sensitive person. Remember, sensitivity is nothing to apologize for. It's our superpower. Have a blessed day.